Today we're taking a bit of a side road in our educational journey toward the postgraduate years and an enlightening conversation with 24-year-old PhD candidate Alana Richards. We want to know how public education supported her in her professional endeavors as she's just starting out, how being schooled in a Spanish immersion program changed the course of her life, and how the IB program in high school was a revelation for her as it gave her the opportunity to develop critical thinking and analytic skills, which she didn't have in general studies in the public school. You're going to be fascinated and perhaps surprised by Alana's retrospective evaluation of the American curriculum compared to what's emphasized in Europe, and the implications of these differences for American students wanting to move in more global communities. Be ready, because as the conversation progresses, we touch on gender fluidity and her suggestion that there be more transparent conversations of topics like these at very young ages in order to create a strong affective domain. You're going to hear that Alana is adamant that if students don't feel seen and accepted, and nowadays that can be as deceptively innocuous as making sure each child has the opportunity to establish the gender identification that feels authentic, she says if we don't do that, learning just can't happen. I think you're going to be enlightened by Alana's perspective as a budding professional, having studied in diverse curriculums all over the world, on her take on what's helpful and what teachers could address more carefully, more closely, more often. You'll find other thought-provoking conversations with educators on a myriad of topics at Doodles with Donna. You can also find activities to augment analytic and critical thinking strategies at scaffoldingmagic.com. So, let's get right into our conversation with Alana Richards as we're outlining the objectives of our conversation together. Alana, welcome.
My goal is to make education more transparent. And with your answers, teachers and parents both might be more informed. Thank you so much for joining. Can you tell us where you grew up, what your educational experience is, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, so thanks for having me. So I grew up in Maryland, right outside of Washington, D.C., lived there my whole life. And in terms of my education, I went to, up through high school in Maryland. In my high school, I did an international baccalaureate program, graduated with that, so the IB diploma. Went to college, a 4-year undergraduate institution, Pennsylvania, where I majored in sociology and Spanish. And then following that, took a year off and then went back for my master's degree, which I got in the Netherlands in gender studies, and am currently back in the US working, aspiring hopefully to get my PhD one day, but working first for a little bit.
And I would call you a budding professional, which means that you're right now moving into the professional arena, although you've been working for most of your life, as most Americans do. We start babysitting. And I'm mentioning that because you know very well that in not all countries that happens, and it's particular to Americans. And what I'd love is, so your perspective on how your education might have helped you, what you would have liked more in education, that sort of thing, but just honest answers, your experience. And so we need to go back a little further because you kind of skipped over your primary school and you had a specific primary school experience. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, of course. So I went to a Spanish immersion elementary school. It was a public school. I got in because my brother was in the lottery and got in. So got lucky because of that. So everything in my education from the age of 5 to 10, so kindergarten to 5th grade in the US, was completely in Spanish, except for my English classes and like a few classes here and there if the teachers couldn't speak Spanish. But math was in Spanish. We did reading in Spanish. Science was in Spanish, history in Spanish, everything. And because I had that opportunity, I am fluent in Spanish, have been able to get so many amazing opportunities since then because of my ability to speak Spanish. And so, yeah, that was definitely just my parents thinking ahead and putting me in a great position. But yeah.
Okay, now, did your parents speak Spanish when you began your bilingual education?
No, they speak so many languages between the two of them. It's ridiculous. I don't even think I can count them on two hands. But in the US, Spanish is such an important language to know, and I think that becomes truer every day. This was a program that was available, and I think they knew it would have really amazing implications, not only for my personal life and career, but also just existing in a country where so many people speak Spanish as their primary language. It seems silly not to be able to speak that language as well to interact with them.
How was it then when you were getting a little bit older and you had homework to do in Spanish and your parents were they able to help you, or how were you supported in that respect?
So my brother went to the same school as me. He's older, so I had him for some things. As I mentioned, my parents speak a lot of languages and they pick it up very easily, which I was super lucky about. So I think they, especially my mom, was able to help me with some things. Just, growing up, me going to a Spanish education, you definitely pick things up along the way. So I did have support in that. But I think more so than that, just teachers, my classmates. I mean, I was still very young, so I wasn't doing anything too complex, I would say. So I feel like whatever my parents couldn't help me with, I had teachers and classmates to help out with.
Okay, and I'm just wondering, looking back on it, because your parents weren't fluent in Spanish and they couldn't directly help you with some of the things, and as you admit, it was kindergarten to fifth grade, right?
Yeah.
So in fifth grade, the content is not that incredibly difficult, but still it wasn't a language that they had studied extensively. Do you think that there's any way to connect the fact that they couldn't help you all the time that might have risen your autonomy?
Oh, interesting. I've actually never thought about it like that. That being said, I think there's definitely reason to what you're saying. I mean, for example, stuff like math homework, numbers are universal, could get help with that. But when you're writing essays in Spanish, and this was even true in middle school and high school and college, where I had to do full-on research papers that were 20 pages long in Spanish. I mean, that's not something that my parents could look over and edit for grammar or anything like that. So I definitely was able to show myself how to access resources. I think that part of being like autonomous is not necessarily doing it on your own, but also just knowing where to look to get help. So if that's not like your parental figure, the people closest to you. So that definitely was something that I had to learn to do in elementary school. But luckily, I feel like I always had access to great resources. And even if my parents couldn't help me with the homework directly, they could, from a young age, taught me where to look to get help.
And it seems like you were also pretty proactive in finding people who could help you or sources, right?
I'd like to think so.
Which is maybe one reason why you're continuing your education. Would you describe yourself as someone who loves to learn or someone who sees the benefit of learning? And so you're continuing your education.
I love to learn. And I think I've known that for a very long time. I think especially in high school when I started doing my International Baccalaureate or IB program and the classes became smaller and more discussion based and less memorization, multiple choice classes, I think I just really was able to use the analytical tools that I feel like I just love using. And then going into college, you get to choose what classes you take and you get to choose your major. And I just really found that I loved being able to read about new things and learn about experiences that I will never get to be a part of.
Okay, and you're in your early 20s, right? Just so that the audience has a context of where you're going. All right, I want to go back to a couple of things because there's studies. The way I understand math is that normally the experts say that we're supposed to learn math in our home language. And so I'm fascinated that you learned it in Spanish. And I'm wondering if you still think in numbers in Spanish or it's always been in English. Tell me about that.
Okay, yeah, this was one of the hardest parts about transitioning from a Spanish school to an English school. So after elementary school, I went to my local middle school, which was all in English. And I remember, even though numbers are universal, even though the words for stuff like addition and division are basically the same in Spanish and English, I remember having so much trouble looking at math problems in English and doing them. And in general, my brain is not one friendly to math. I've known that for a while, much more reliant on the humanities, social sciences. But I do remember I struggled to make that switch. I think once I made it, I didn't go back. Like now numbers, I look at numbers completely in like an English sense. Once you are doing them in your native language, I think it's easier to stick with that. But definitely, I remember sixth grade math class was really challenging at first because I just could not comprehend how to do math in English, which seems so silly because they're numbers, but it really took me a bit to transition.
No, it doesn't seem silly at all because, as I say, the experts say that we're supposed to be learning math. No matter in any bilingual context, math is supposed to be taught in your home language, but in your case, it wasn't. And you obviously are able to make the transition between the two. If you're in a Spanish speaking environment, you have absolutely no problem with the concept of numbers when you're speaking. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think like just being so young, even when I was transitioning from Spanish to English and classes like math, like I was still so young. I was 10, 11. And I think your brain is still so malleable at that age, which is probably why I could do it. And now just only do it in English, but also can do it in Spanish if I need to. But I imagine if I had been speaking Spanish my whole life up until this moment, now that I'm 24, and someone made me do something, a math problem in English, I don't know if I could ever only do it in English. I think the benefit of being young and having a malleable brain really was to my benefit there.
Okay, and then I also want to address the whole dynamic of the fact that your parents, I consider them incredibly brave in sending you to a bilingual school in which you were going to learn a language that they were not proficient in. There are many parents, you know that I live in Spain, and English is a big thing in Spain, and it's very important in Europe and all over the world, we can say. Many parents are very nervous sending their children to bilingual schools because they feel nervous, they feel inadequate. Many parents, especially obviously the ones that I work with, have overcome their fear to a certain extent and let their children work in school in English, even though it brings up a lot of issues for them. You have an interesting perspective being the child who was sent to a bilingual immersion program by parents who weren't proficient in that. Looking back on it again, what can you tell me about your experience, the advantages, disadvantages, anything you picked up from your parents, anything you had to overcome?
I can genuinely not think of one disadvantage to being sent to an immersion school. The transition between Spanish to English learning for the first year out was at times difficult, but I genuinely think that my parents made such an amazing decision for me. I also think we were so lucky to have it as a public school option. So it was something that they didn't have to pay extra money for. But if the option is there, allowing your kid to learn another language, especially one, for example, in the context of Spain, where English gives kids access to new opportunities, education, different places, the parents are giving that child just a world of opportunities. And my parents did the same thing for me by sending me to my Spanish immersion school. So just being able to know another language is just like the tip of the iceberg. Meeting people, forming connections. I went abroad to Argentina for a year. If I did not have my Spanish background, I would not have felt comfortable doing that. I lived with a host family. We spoke only Spanish. I had internships there. Like I would not have been able to do any of that without having the grounded background of going to an immersion school. And I think my parents, because they knew languages, even though it wasn't Spanish, they just knew how many doors it had opened for them. And they just wanted to give my brother and I that opportunity.
Were your teachers all native Spanish speakers?
Yeah, I think so. I don't remember one that wasn't.
Do you think that it might have made any difference if any of them had not been native Spanish speakers?
I think my Spanish teachers after elementary school weren't native Spanish speakers. And I remember feeling a difference. And I don't know how to explain it other than little things that I noticed, like the accents were different. There's much more focus on grammar, which was good, but also hard because there was never a focus on grammar in elementary school. And I think just in general, when your teacher's native language is Spanish, little conversations you have outside of the classroom, maybe those happen in Spanish too. Or when you have a question, maybe you ask the question in Spanish. And even if they respond in English, you know that Spanish is the default. And I think that is important. And I think way besides that, just the cultural learning that happened in the classroom with teachers that were native Spanish speakers. I had teachers from so many different countries from South and Central America. So I didn't only learn Spanish, I learned about their culture,
So how much of the culture did you learn when you were growing up, do you think, in middle school? Now, middle school, just so we're clear, middle school is 6th to 8th grade. Okay, so it's about 12 years old to 15 years old. So in your Spanish language classes, because you had to make this transition from being an immersion program, and then you learned Spanish in school, which is kind of ironic because you were already fluent, at least in the understanding of it, correct?
Yes.
How was that transition?
I think that was the hardest part about transitioning from Spanish immersion to an English school was my Spanish classes. It was a middle school. I couldn't test into a higher level of Spanish. They put me into the intro Spanish class, which was for people who they assumed had never learned Spanish in their life. So at first it was the alphabet, and that was a joke. It was so easy. But then we started learning grammar, and I'd never learned grammar. There had never been a focus on it. I think it's the same when people who grow up speaking any language, but for example, if you grow up speaking English, sometimes grammar can be really difficult because you just talk the way you talk. You don't know the rules. You just know that what you're saying is correct. And you know that what you're writing is correct, but you can't necessarily say why. And in Spanish, there are so many tenses. There's so many rules. And it felt like I had to go back to the beginning. I had to forget. I had to take away the assumption that what I'm saying is correct and talk about why what I was saying was correct. I had to talk about why would I use the preterite versus the imperfect. And I think I did fine, but I definitely was not acing those Spanish classes when they got to the grammar because it was so difficult for me to think about Spanish in that way when my whole life I'd just been speaking it, I'd just been writing it. I'd never been told the, grammatically correct way to do it.
Okay, so what you've done is actually pinpointed the difference between acquiring a language and learning a language. And when your home language is where you're acquiring it, it's organic. And it sounds like in your immersion program, because you began so young at 5 years old, you were acquiring the language in a very natural way, and you were speaking to teachers in class and outside of class in Spanish. So I guess my question here is, are you aware now of the difference between how you see language and how friends who have learned the language, let me just specify that learning the language is exactly what you're talking about the structure, talking about why one word goes before another, which is appropriate. We won't say correct or incorrect. I try not to use those words because in different countries, language is used differently. We can say, especially English. The English that's used in India is very different than the English we use in the States or in England. And yet it's completely appropriate, completely what it did there. So I'm wondering if among your friends, is their attitude towards language learning different than yours?
I think for people who started learning languages later in life, even if that was middle school, even if I know some people who took language class in elementary school, but it wasn't all day, every day. It was like one class starting when you were 8. Even those people, I think learning languages was always more of a chore or a task. And I think for me, because I guess, as you put it, I had acquired the language, it was already something that I knew was already a part. It felt like something that was already a part of me. I will say on the technical side, for example, when I was in Argentina studying abroad during college, there was a very big noticeable difference between people who either Spanish was their native language, so their parents spoke Spanish at home, or it was their first language and then their school taught them English, or someone like me who'd went to an immersion program, so I'd been speaking Spanish for a while, and people who had just started taking classes in middle school. There's a big difference in comfort in speaking. I felt like I could adapt a lot easier to the slang that was used and I was in Argentina, so they use like vos very differently, for example, that kind of thing. I felt like I could adapt pretty easily to. It took other people a harder time to get used to different language structures. That being said, like we had to take a Spanish class in Argentina, and I was put in the beginner Spanish class because I did not do as well on the grammar test than the people who had learned the language and learned the grammar from the very beginning. So very different experiences, but I would say there's definitely a difference in comfort right off the bat that I really felt and noticed.
So do you think that's translated into other parts of your life? Because as you said, you did your master's in the Netherlands, and this is not a language that you either knew or now know. You learned in English, correct?
Yeah, my school's in English.
However, you lived in a society in which English was not the primary language. Is there any way to connect your comfort with languages to your comfort in living in a country where you did not speak the dominant language?
I definitely, I will say a caveat to the Netherlands is that I knew going in that almost everyone speaks English there in a similar, kids are doing bilingual education for the most part there. So I knew there was that cushion, but I definitely was not worried. I tried learning Dutch, went in, no one even spoke to me in Dutch, so it felt irrelevant. But I knew that I would be able to get by. I think that I definitely felt comfortable. And again, I think maybe that connects back to just knowing who to ask, how to get help when you need it. I knew how to access those if I needed to. So I would say, yeah, it probably hadn't had an impact.
Okay, so again, I'm wondering about this arc because you started in an immersion program where your parents were not proficient in the language, and so you had to learn a certain amount of autonomy and look for resources. And as you move through your education, by the time you were in the Netherlands, you again had to find a lot of resources by yourself and be fairly independent, or at least know who to ask. And I'm wondering if there's a connection there. You could see it, or I'm just inventing the whole thing.
Well, what I will say is that in addition to the Spanish language education, my parents were really big proponents of me going abroad. Both of them had lived abroad for certain amounts of time. My mother has lived abroad on more than one occasion in different places where they speak different languages. My mother lived in Japan, where it's a different alphabet completely. So I think they were really big proponents of that. They knew how autonomous and independent it could make someone. And I think that just growing up in that mindset, I feel like I grew up in a very global household, even though we never moved from our house. And even though it wasn't like we were traveling so much as children, I just grew up with the mindset that I was going to take advantage of those resources. When I went to Argentina, it was my first time going abroad, and I was there for a year, and there were parts of it that were incredibly difficult. And definitely times I was like, I could leave right now. But again, it's just one of those things where I felt myself getting more independent. I felt myself knowing where to go, who to ask for, how to do things on my own. And then after that experience, going abroad again for my master's program felt so much easier because I knew exactly, obviously it was a different place, a different country, a different sort of situation I was putting myself into. But I just knew how to get the help I needed if I needed it.
I'd love to go into the methodology a bit because I think that you're aware of methodology. And I'm wondering now, as a 24-year-old, how the methodology that you were affected by has affected your professional career. So the immersion program, we won't go into right now. Let's talk about middle school, high school, the IB program especially, and then go into university.
So when you say methodology, do you mean methods of teaching?
In other words, were teachers talking to you all day long, or were you working in groups, or were you doing flipped classroom, for instance, where you're doing a lot of the work at home and then collaborative work in the classroom?
I think that the school district I was a part of was very progressive for its time. And I give it a lot of credit for being very focused on group work and very focused on tailoring to different types of learning because so many people learn differently. And so making sure that kids had different sensory experiences to help them learn. That being said, in the US, standardized testing is so big and it's just the means. And I think we're moving away from that. But when I was in school, it was the means to getting into college and it was the means to securing your school funding from the state and from the government. So even though there were different types of activities, at the end of the day, the teacher needed all the kids to be prepared for a test that was multiple choice I think it was all multiple choice. I think maybe some had short answers or an essay, but 90% multiple choice, 10% in essay. And it happened every year. Even in elementary school, we were taking standardized testing. And to prepare for that, there's not much you can do other than take multiple choice tests and get readings and get lectures and all of that. So that was a big part of my educational experience, especially in middle school and early high school. I think what IB did for me that changed that was, yes, there were tests at the end of my IB, at the end of my degree. None of them were multiple choice. They were all short answer or essay based. And thus, there was never one right answer. There are always many right answers. That was the biggest shift in terms of teaching methodology. In those classes, it would sometimes start with a lecture, but it always ended in a discussion. It was very interactive. We would do a reading and talk about it. We would do an activity and talk about it, group or individual. And that was what got carried over to my college and my university. All of our classes were small group discussion based.
And then in high school, in the IB program, what I'd also like parents to know, if they're not familiar with it, and I know that some parents I've talked to are not familiar with it, it's not just a program where critical thinking is developed and promoted, but there's also a financial aspect to it. Could you explain how, if you get a certain grade in the IB program, that you get credits towards your university?
Yeah, so I actually graduated and was able to, if I wanted to, I could have done college in 3 years instead of 4. So 4 is standard. If you go in having absolutely no credit, you do it all in 4 years, usually in the US. With all of my IB credits, because they're considered college level courses in high school, I was able to fill requirements that I needed in college and thus could have graduated in 3 years. I didn't. I ended up going abroad for a year instead, hence why I graduated in 4 years. But by the time I was a senior, I was a part-time student, actually. So I was taking 2 classes and then also working for my university, but it helped vastly because, again, the IB program was a part of my public school, so it was completely free. And yeah, being a part-time student or graduating 3 years is a whole lot cheaper than full-time for 4 years.
Aside from the fact that the methodology in the IB program is so positive and so proactive, how do you think that having the education in IB has helped you in your professional career, or has it?
Oh, 100%. I think IB was the first time in school where we were taught to think analytically. Like, I was thinking about education because you'd sent me some questions, and one of the questions was like, how do you define education? So I was like, okay, I gotta look it up on Merriam-Webster. And a lot of the definitions were like instruction. And that felt so wrong to me. I don't think education is instruction. And if it is, it shouldn't be. And I think IB was the first time where I was given space and my classmates were given space to develop critical thinking skills. There was never a right or, sometimes obviously there are right and wrong answers, but it was never like facts versus falsehoods. It was knowing about the gray areas, talking about them, understanding the world in complex ways. And that in high school, not many people get that opportunity. In college, not many people get that opportunity. And so just to have those critical thinking skills, to have them be developed, even now in my job, in my everyday life, just being able to use those critical thinking skills, those analytical skills, absolutely, that there's such a benefit to having them be developed in high school.
And you brought up a really important point. I'm a teacher, but I think of myself as a facilitator, because I think that if I go into the classroom ready to teach, then I'm the center of the attention. And that's not what I want it to be. I want the students to be the center of attention. So I consider myself an educational facilitator because I walk into the classroom wanting to help students learn. And that's what it sounds like you experienced in your IB program. Is that fair assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned, we would read and then talk about it, or have activities and then talk about, we had an epistemology class, which was all about the theory of knowing and knowing how we know things. And we had amazing teachers who would, exactly what you said, facilitate discussions and just help us think about the world in different ways than we'd ever thought of. And also, which I think is another thing that is really was special about IB, and then also special about my college experience, encourage us students not to look at teachers as the all-knowing, end-all, be-all. They were really upfront. We are not gods, or we don't know everything. You should question us. You should question the school. You should question the systems that have put these educational institutions in place. And that also was something that I absolutely still use today.
No, I love that. And I don't know if I've ever told you this, that when I was in high school, we wore buttons, and you don't wear buttons anymore, but I wore a button that I'm sure was not very popular with my teachers. And what it said was simply two words: question authority. I wasn't saying rebel against authority. I wasn't saying disobey authority. I was just saying question authority. And this was long before what I understood education should be, or ideally can be, in that it's a place where we can explore, and where there are no correct answers. There are many correct answers, as you said. As long as we can justify it, we can have a lot of creativity in justifying our perspectives, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right, now I'm curious about something else, because I just am trying to explore all the different perspectives and influences on your life and your education. And by the way, can you give me a definition of education?
I thought a lot about what education is not, but I really like your idea of education as facilitation. And I think education as a growing space. At this point in time, I could not give you a concrete definition of education, but I can confidently say I do not think education is instruction, which is what Google told me it was.
Okay, all right. Well, I really appreciate that. I want to look at, a lot of people see the States as one country. And in fact, it really is, it's a country with so many different perspectives and so many ways to see the world. You've grown up on the East Coast. Not only that, you grew up right on the cusp of Washington, D.C. There is probably more influence on you than you may think, or maybe having studied abroad in Argentina and in the Netherlands and met people who have not grown up on the East Coast, have a different perspective towards the possibilities and the global environment. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, so it is true that I probably grew up, my county that I grew up in was named multiple times, one of the best educational counties in the States, or in the country. There was a variety of classes we could take. So I think in like history classes, there was always like some of the history classes that I took, there was like, we talked about African American history, but it was still so lacking. And I didn't even realize how much it was lacking until I went to college. We would spend half a day talking about the Trail of Tears. For context, the Trail of Tears was something that happened when Americans were moving west and kicked out all the Native Americans or indigenous people from their lands and literally forced them to relocate. And it was not talked about like a genocide. It was just talked about. We talked about it for usually half a day. Sometimes we talked about it on Columbus Day, which shouldn't even exist. So I think recently our school, the high school that I went to, added like a queer history class, which is absolutely amazing. But we certainly did not learn about queer history when I was in high school. And if you wanted to know that, that was something you had to take on your own. We had so many US history classes. We had so many US government classes, which felt very relevant because, as you mentioned, we were on the cusp of DC. So it was a very US centered education. And IB was probably, because it's literally called International Baccalaureate, we also learned about South America and Canada, but that was it. I mean, there was really no global context. And when I went abroad to the Netherlands, so many people know about the politics of the US. They know about the current events. And I didn't know anything about the Netherlands before I got there. I didn't know about their government system. I didn't know about their history. I didn't know really anything, but so many people knew about my countries.
So what you're saying is the United States education can be considered to be very ethnocentric, whereas in Europe, I'm very aware that Europeans, no matter what economic class they are, they're very aware of what's going on in the world. Let's go back to methodology and you as a professional. What would you ideally consider to be valuable in schools that was not taught when you were in school?
If you mentioned like the US has so many different ideas and places. So if you go a little further south to places like Florida, Texas, those are like the more well-known examples. They don't want to teach critical race theory, which is the basic premise of understanding that racism has always been in the US and we have to understand US history from a perspective. They don't want to teach that. They don't want to teach LGBTQ plus history. That's all very much up for debate right now, going on, a lot of contention there. I think those are things that need to be included in education regardless of place. The IB had a strong like feminist curriculum, especially in English. So we learned a lot about female writers and female authors and their literature, which was amazing, but could have done more. So I think those basic things of understanding the ways in which social systems are impacting the way that we view our own education and our own history need to be implemented. And then besides that, I think it's really important to have a more global education. I think Europe does a better job of doing that, certainly better than the US. And I think it's just giving kids the opportunity to learn about places that are not the US if they want to.
Well, we're going to talk gender fluidity. Core question here is it a topic that needs to be addressed? I was speaking with one math teacher from California, and I said, I have some great ideas from you. I have some great activities that might help you. And she said, listen, there's a big issue about transsexuality in my classroom. And until I get that settled, there's nothing I can do. They don't want anything. So we had a whole discussion on gender fluidity. And I'm wondering if that's something that you feel needs to be addressed in the school or is.
Yeah, these are kids and these are teenagers, and they are not going to focus on their education if they don't feel like their basic identity is being respected, point blank, period. I have a friend who's an elementary school teacher in Colorado. So she teaches 8 and 9-year-olds, so third and fourth graders in the US. And for them, they're still so young, where very early on, she just made it known that if you ever have big feelings about your gender or about your sexuality, this is a safe space and you can just open up about them. And she will have students raise their hand one day and say, like, I'm identifying as with these pronouns now, or like, I prefer to be called this name now. And the kids do not care at all. They don't. I think that it's the teachers and the adults that have made it such a contentious issue. But as I mentioned, it just is not appropriate to ask a child or a teenager to focus on school if they don't feel safe or if they don't feel like their identity is being respected.
So even if a child isn't completely conscious of the fact that she or he may have an issue with sexual identification or a little bit of differences, it still is appreciated. The teachers still need to address it to a certain extent, right?
I think so. I think it's really our personal lives impact our education, our professional lives every day. Like your boss gets angry at you and you find out it's because they were having a bad day because of something that happened at home, whatever. I think that the same thing happens in school. Like if you were having an argument with a parent and then you go to school and then you're upset, like the teacher needs to know that your personal life impacts how you are in school and how you are able to learn and how you're able to achieve. And so I think that the teacher needs to set a precedent very early on that it's all different identities are accepted and it's a safe space and questioning is okay, and to make room for that so that there's also room so you don't get to a critical breaking point where there's no room for learning.
Okay, I really appreciate all of those comments. And the fact is that what the studies show is that at 3 years old, many children already know that they're different than their peers. And so we do need to address. I mean, when I was in school, you were heterosexual. It wasn't even talked about that there were homosexuals or any other differences. And society has changed enormously, I think for the better, that there's more transparency because we need to recognize who we are. And there's always been this fluidity. It's just now we're talking about it more openly. Mm. All right, Alana, you have shared such a wealth of knowledge about your experiences in the immersion program and the IB program and your professional and your love of learning, but also what that learning has offered you. And I would love to open up this conversation again in the future to see where you're going, because you've been very proactive. You're only 24 years old and you're beginning your doctorate, but you've been working for, let's say, the past 10, 11 years. And where would you like to be in the future? Where would you like to be in 5 years?
I think so. I'm currently working on a research project that is slated to be about 4 years long. I think I want to see it out. I want to know what happens. I feel like that's one of the amazing parts of doing research is seeing it from start to finish. And I think that through that process, I would love to start taking classes or start my doctorate. So next fall, I'll be doing some classes, see how that goes, and then hopefully able to start my PhD, which is a long, long process in the States, especially for someone who wants to do it in the social sciences. So I think in the next 5 years, ideally, I'm on that path. as I mentioned, I love to learn. I want my career to be just endless learning and growing and experiencing new knowledge. And I hope in 5 years, that's exactly what I'm doing.
Well, we're going to find out. I just want to thank you again for sharing all this information.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
So that's our talk with Alana Richards, a passionate learner and a recent graduate who has a wide perspective on how her education has affected her professional and social opportunities. You'll find other conversations that delve into the quintessential educational topics that can affect our students and children profoundly at Doodles with Donna. And please check out scaffolding activities that can promote analytic thinking at scaffoldingmagic.com. In the meantime, see you soon and have fun in your classes and at home.